Zero trust security has come to dominate cybersecurity strategy discussions in recent years, all the more so with the recent White House executive order on cybersecurity. Many organizations, of course, have begun rationalizing their zero trust strategies and have revisited their access and control and identity management capabilities as the work from anywhere model became the new normal in recent months. Organizations are also now exploring the next level of zero trust architectures and looking for ways to enhance data protection policies and how they get data to and from the clouds and between the clouds. I'm Wyatt Cash on behalf of CyberScoop, and we're here with Brian Gardner, Chief Information Security Officer for the City of Dallas. Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Let me start by asking, how is the City of Dallas and your agency in particular approaching the goal of first of all, treating data as a strategic asset? And more specifically, how are you leveraging or planning to leverage zero trust architecture and framework models to protect your data as it transverses from device to cloud and cloud to cloud?
Thank you. So it's an interesting question, Wyatt, because although we talk about, and I'm going to back up just a little bit, we talk about the COVID and us having to work from home and this really distributed workforce that we're doing. But honestly, here at the city, we were headed down that road prior to COVID. So we were looking at the zero trust architecture and that model in that fashion to get there anyways. This has been somewhat beneficial. It's allowed us from some grant money to expedite some of those, as well as become challenging because we didn't have the opportunity to go, hey, we're going to take this, we're going to test it. We kind of got thrown into the deep end with the whole distributed model to begin with, right? We had a couple of weeks and guess what? Everybody's working remote. So I came from an organization that was fairly distributed, so I didn't get too flustered in that. But I could see that on our employees and our workers. Oh my gosh, you're asking me to understand how to work remote. I've never done that in my whole life. And I've had a 25-year career here. And so there was a lot of training that went into that. So that the people piece is a huge component of this, right? So for us in private, you have the crown jewels and you protect the crown jewels and everything is very, very maintain that strategy to protect all of the data. In government, we have this, we have a couple little rules like FOIA and open records that we have to deal with. So our data tends to be heavy on very public type data versus the other model. Now, that does not mean we do not have those quote unquote crown jewels we have to protect. So we have to start devising that strategy around those areas where that data is significantly more sensitive or regulated so that we can protect that data, but also keeping that balance where that data becomes public. So that's kind of an interesting balancing act. And I've been in several conferences where I sit down in a group and we start talking about, well, we're protecting the crown jewels. And I say, well, my strategy is way different because I have this big group of data that I have to not protect. I actually have to provide back to the public in that fashion. So to answer your question around the strategy, like I said, we start looking at where does the protected data or the sensitive data reside and understanding who needs access, right? Access is the first and foremost primary thing to a strategy around protecting the data and your zero trust. So who has access to it? Here at the city, we started implementing things in that zero trust model, multi-factor, privileged access management, really starting asking the questions every time you ask that data. Is this truly you that's accessing the data? So from that perspective, that is our first and foremost. That was step one in our process, is really who has access to it, when they have access to it, and asking the question every time they have access to it. And then those that don't need access to it, you don't get access to it, or you need privileged access to it, really, really scrutinizing those points.
Well, and then thinking about how zero trust and endpoint security intersect. How has endpoint security evolved around users' own devices, bring your own device, and government furnished equipment, for example, over the past 12 to 18 months to sort of coincide with your zero trust practices? And how are you seeking to better secure data under these types of end user security models?
Well, honestly, Wyatt, it goes back to my original answer where, we were headed down that path. We were looking at those best practices in that around the device. So to that point, some of this, like I mentioned, really helped us accelerate that to getting to that finish line a little faster. So like here, what we did is device control tended to be very centralized on the network. Well, now you have a distributed workforce. Some of your workforce may or may not connect to the network every time. So you have to start understanding on how can I control a device that is not sitting on the network, or how can I control that access and that what is residing on that data. So you start coming up with a good game plan on how you can control a device that is very distributed and not accessing the network. And for us, what we did is we did a lot of cloud migration for our security technologies. We moved to, as soon as that device hits the internet, we now can take control of that device. And those are the plans that, like I said, they were already in the works. We were headed down that path. We just had to forgo some testing, I would say, which is not always the best plan in IT, but at the moment it was the plan. So that's where we were. As far as like BYOD, we got fairly lucky. We had a very small footprint of BYOD. And what that allowed us to do is only have to deal with a very small footprint of that. And as soon as we had the ability to remove them and just issue them government issued devices, then we moved them to that. In the interim, what we did is anybody that accessed the network, we set parameters. You could access this. It was very controlled. It was very limited. We had scanning done on their personal devices, which I know causes some heartburn with people. But look, that was the world, a little over a year ago that we lived in, and you can't forego security just for convenience. So you have to balance that act.
Well, next, I'd like to talk about the impact of the supply chain attack that's rattled many organizations, initially involving SolarWinds earlier this year, late last year, and how that really compromised a lot of government and commercial IT networks. And what it really said was that, hackers had discovered some new ability to compromise certificates or root of trust between products and move undetected across enterprises. So my question for you here would be, what advice would you offer organizations, or what are you trying to do to protect data from an apparent trusted user, that sort of insider user case, as it were? And are user behavior analytics and policies enough to defend against these advanced threats?
I'm going to tell you no to that last question. And the reasoning, and I'll get to it in a sec, is really when you say zero trust itself, right? It's zero trust. Even though I know it's you, Wyatt, zero trust. I'm going to make you jump through a lot of hoops, hopefully in a very easy manner for the end user to getting in here. And I know that it's, I know it's Wyatt. He's in here. We've validated it's Wyatt. We've done everything we can. On the backside of that, and when I say that no is really because you have to have a plan for disaster. And I believe Chris Krebs has said this, is part of this plan really has to be that recovery piece. And the recovery piece is so critical to getting the business back on their feet, where they need to go and how they need to get there. Defining that is critical. That's one of the pieces that it's not particular to government, that across my travels, has been in that disaster recovery piece. It's a cost, right? It's a cost to have disaster recovery if you never used it, but it's an insurance policy, and we all have insurance policies anymore, right? From soup to nuts. And so it's critical to have that disaster recovery piece so that when something bad happens, and it's a when, you have that ability to get them back on their feet. But it's also understanding what is critical to the business, or to, in this case, the city, to what is most critical here. Obviously, public safety, huge, right? Critical infrastructure, huge. So, that becomes your top tier focus. But there's other things that you may not understand until you really do, a business impact analysis, and you start really looking at your whole DR plan on what that is, because, we have animal control, we have parks, we have things that may on the surface seem not as critical, but they are, or the convention center in the event of a disaster, that is actually critical infrastructure, and we have to plan to making sure that they're back on their feet.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, Brian Gardner, thank you so much for taking a few minutes to share some of your insights about zero trust and some of the efforts that you're making to ensure greater security for the city of Dallas and its population.
Thank you, Wyatt.